The beginning of a case, a small quiet town. Nestled in the heartland of Oklahoma was a picturesque town where time seemed to have hit the pause button. Elmstead was one of those places where everyone knew everyone else, the kind of town you'd picture on a postcard. Whispering fields of wheat, the occasional church steeple breaking the horizon, and old rustic barns described the scenery. The morning started with the smell of coffee drifting through diners lining the main street, and life meandered at its own sleepy pace. But beneath its idyllic facade, Elmstead was not entirely as pristine as it appeared. For decades it had remained an insular community, resistant to change, where traditions ran deep, often too deep for their own good. People here weren't big talkers, unless it was about the weather or Friday night high school football games. Serious matters were often swept under the rug. After all, preserving the image of peace and simplicity was the town's unwritten rule. Outsiders were rarely welcomed with open arms, and those who tried to blend in often found themselves hitting an invisible wall of suspicion and coded small-town gossip. So, when 6 women disappeared over the course of just 1 year, the town didn't know how to react. Locals whispered about the strange happenings, but no one wanted to admit just how abnormal it was. How could this tiny bubble of Americana, where life revolved around church services, potluck dinners, and the 4th of July parade, harbor anything more sinister than teenage pranks, or an occasional deer wandering onto someone's front porch? The missing women had one thing in common: they were invisible, at least as far as Elmstead's social strata was concerned. From waitresses struggling to make rent to single mothers living paycheck to paycheck, these women didn't raise eyebrows when they stopped showing up. The police chief, Sheriff Don Parker, an aging man with more experience writing parking tickets than solving crimes, initially chalked the disappearances up to personal choices. "People leave, folks," he'd told reporters at one point. "They move on. It's nature." But it wasn't just nature. Late one October evening, just as the falling leaves blanketed the red brick streets, a local farmer made a chilling discovery. Out by Route 17, where the fields stretched endlessly under a vast amber sunset, he found an abandoned car. The doors were locked, the windows dusted with dirt, and the rearview mirror dangled as though someone had tried to yank it off. Inside, there was more. There was a pool of dried blood soaked into the fabric of the passenger seat, barely visible until flashlights illuminated the space. A tattered list of women's names and addresses, scrawled hastily in pencil, was stuffed into the glove compartment. Rumors swept like wildfire. Was it a local? Could it be a stranger passing through? The townsfolk speculated endlessly, but nobody really wanted the truth. Elmstead wasn't the sort of place where they had a killer. That was something that happened in big cities where gangs lurked behind alleyways or rich suburbanites plotted bloody betrayals in gilded mansions. For Sheriff Parker, though, the whole situation represented unfamiliar terrain. His force wasn't equipped for this, and neither was his town. With little evidence and nothing but growing dread among the community, Parker called in state investigators. That was the day Elmstead's fragile facade began to crack. Helicopters with searchlights flew overhead, and uniformed officers roamed the streets asking uncomfortable questions. Everyone's usual conversations about crop yields and church bake sales quickly turned to whispered theories about what dark forces might have invaded their idyllic home. As state troopers gathered more data, patterns began to crystallize. Each of the missing women had been seen in or near the same area before vanishing, the far eastern outskirts of town. The locals referred to that area as the Dead Acres, an eerie stretch of farmland where rumors about hauntings and strange lights had ripened over decades. It once belonged to an eccentric old man who died alone in his dilapidated ranch. Since then, nature had reclaimed most of the land, but very occasionally late at night, passerby reported strange activity. Dim lantern lights bobbing across the fields like phantom beacons. Yet for years, Elmstead's residents never dared question what lay out there in the acres of tall grass and ghostly silos. To them, it wasn't worth the trouble of wondering. But now, as 6 missing women hovered like unspeakable shadows over Elmstead's otherwise sunny reputation, the Dead Acres were about to become the focus of law enforcement's painstaking investigation. Unbeknownst to those scattered townsfolk peering out from their kitchen windows, a storm of revelations was about to descend upon Elmstead that would unravel its quiet townsfolk's lives forever. The dark tradition, the bizarre belief in spiritual marriages. In the shadowy corners of a world that prided itself on progress and modernization, deep in the forgotten heartlands of the Midwest, there lingered a peculiar and unnerving tradition. Known by its practitioners as spiritual marriages, this bizarre custom turned old superstitions into macabre rituals. While the rest of the country debated technology and the future, these quiet, insular communities were still tied to centuries-old beliefs about the dead and their unfinished lives. The origins of this strange practice were murky at best, shrouded in whispers and passed down through generations of family lore. It stemmed from an old superstitious narrative, the idea that the souls of individuals who died unmarried would wander restlessly for eternity, unable to find peace. According to these beliefs, they were doomed to become lonely spirits, causing misfortune to their surviving loved ones or haunting the land around them. The solution? A spiritual marriage that united the deceased with another soul, sometimes another dead person but disturbingly often, a living individual. In places like Elmstead, these beliefs had long since woven themselves into the cultural fabric. The townspeople might not talk openly about it, but behind shuttered windows and closed doors, families whispered about the importance of appeasing restless spirits. To them, a well-rested spirit meant harmony for those left behind. It was a solution born of desperation, fear, and perhaps guilt. After all, in these communities the collective good often took precedence over the individual's rights. These so-called spiritual marriages weren't simply about ceremonial peace. They became a delicate dance between tradition and morality, and at some point they veered into darker, more sinister territory. Families desperate to marry off a lost loved one would search near and far for a suitable spouse, alive or dead. And when no options presented themselves naturally, money and power began to weave into the ritual. The practice was straightforward. The deceased would symbolically marry someone, a woman bought from another state, someone recently deceased in the neighboring county, or, in the most horrifying cases, someone who disappeared mysteriously under suspicious circumstances. Rings were exchanged, names written in family Bibles, and occasional gravestones inscribed as if the match had been legitimate all along. Afterwards, the bodies, or sometimes personal belongings of the chosen spouse, were placed in the same grave or buried side by side to seal the spiritual union. If it all sounded bizarre and unthinkable to outsiders, then this was only because of how hush-hush the tradition was kept. Even in Elmstead, only the most trusted families and the oldest elders discussed these marriages freely. Outsiders were considered too modern to understand, or worse, prone to ridicule the beliefs that tied these communities together. "It's tradition," they would say dismissively when younger generations challenged it, and tradition keeps the peace. However, the tradition didn't always play out as innocently as the wedding-like descriptions suggested. Over time, a dark marketplace began to bubble under the surface. Unscrupulous figures, often people on society's fringes, began offering their services to families desperate for a spiritual union. These brokers made shady deals, profiting from the pain and superstitions of others. One such individual, Nathan McCarthy, became infamous in small-town circles for his role in arranging spiritual marriages. To the casual observer, McCarthy seemed like an ordinary man, perhaps a bit rough around the edges, but harmless. He had worked for years as a funeral director, crafting his comforting voice and somber demeanor to suit the profession. Behind the scenes, though, McCarthy had cultivated a much darker trade, selling the bodies of women he'd claimed had no surviving relatives, or worse, orchestrating abductions and murders to meet the growing demand for spouses. At first, there was a pretense of morality surrounding the practice. Families claimed they only participated to protect the souls of the dearly departed, but the truth wasn't so clean. Some families, overwhelmed by guilt or paranoia, paid astronomical sums to ensure their dead relatives wouldn't bring bad luck to their descendants. Others justified the expense by leaning on tradition, swearing it was the honorable thing to do. The moral dilemmas, however, grew thornier when the available supply of spouses ran dry. That's when women, often transient or vulnerable, started to vanish without a trace. To scam potential buyers, criminals staged bodies to appear freshly deceased or fabricated backstories. In rare but horrifying instances, living women were abducted, held captive, and ultimately silenced forever to fulfill the role of a spectral bride. Nathan McCarthy was at the very center of this twisted system, making thousands of dollars per transaction. One case in particular drove home the horrors of the practice. A young woman from a neighboring county, Emily Saunders, had been struggling to get by as a waitress after fleeing an abusive household. To the townsfolk around her, Emily was both forgettable and disposable, a perfect target. After receiving a cryptic job offer that promised better pay, she disappeared without a word. Weeks later, her name appeared on a marriage certificate, paired with a local rancher who had died of a heart attack just 2 months before. Her parents, out of fear and shame, were paid to stay silent. Word of this practice rarely left the tight-knit communities where it thrived, and for good reason. The deeper one ventured into the details of these spiritual marriages, the more disturbing the revelations became. Instead of releasing restless souls, many such unions seemed to create a fresh wave of victims, of suffering, of abuse, and in many cases, of unthinkable violence. For Elmstead, the stories of spiritual marriages were never unfamiliar, but when state investigators began digging into the town's increasing number of missing persons reports, the old tradition emerged into the spotlight in a way it never had before, and the truth was much darker than anyone could have imagined. The mastermind, a manipulator of belief. Nathan McCarthy was the kind of man you wouldn't look twice at on the street. Stocky, with a receding hairline and a slightly hunched posture, he blended perfectly into the background of Elmstead's small-town life. He owned McCarthy and Sons Funeral Services on the outskirts of town, a family business he inherited from his father. To outsiders, he seemed harmless, an unassuming man who spent his days embalming bodies and offering canned condolences to grieving families. But behind the closed doors of his funeral parlor, Nathan McCarthy harbored a shocking secret. He wasn't just preparing people for the afterlife, he was profiting from it in the most ghastly way imaginable. McCarthy had grown up in Elmstead, steeped in the superstitions that defined its close-knit, stagnant community. His father, a stern and religious man, believed deeply in the stories about restless spirits and curses brought on by unwed deceased family members. Nights in the McCarthy household were often spent by candlelight as his father lectured about how mortuary work was a sacred duty, a way of helping families find peace, and keeping ghosts at bay. For Nathan, these stories weren't just bedtime tales, they were lessons in how fear could be turned into control. But as he got older, Nathan saw something else in his father's sermons, an opportunity. By the time he took over the funeral home, Nathan had picked up his father's skills but left his ethics behind. He had a practiced, gentle smile and a voice that dripped with artificial sympathy, perfect for putting grieving families at ease. But beneath his somber exterior, he was always watching, always calculating. He could tell which clients were the most desperate, the most superstitious. And it was this combination of vulnerability and belief that Nathan expertly manipulated to expand his business, not in embalming bodies, but in selling them. For years, McCarthy had been operating in the shadows, pulling strings, and growing his network. At first, it started innocently, or at least, not criminally. Local families would approach him, troubled by the thought that their unmarried son or daughter might never find peace in the afterlife. "Isn't there some way to help them?" they would ask, tears streaking their faces. Nathan, ever the understanding professional, would nod solemnly. "There are options, of course," he'd say, "though it's a bit unorthodox." These grieving families were often willing to pay tremendous sums just to keep their loved ones' spirits at rest. But providing spouses for the dead wasn't easy. Initially, McCarthy tried to find legitimate solutions, reaching out to other funeral directors to see if they had any unmarried bodies that families might not claim. But the market, yes, there was a market, was more competitive than Nathan had anticipated. Word traveled quickly in the mortuary world, and suddenly, McCarthy was no longer the only one brokering spiritual marriages. He needed an edge. That's when his business turned dark. McCarthy began to exploit the most vulnerable members of society, transient women, sex workers, and runaways. These were people who weren't rooted in Elmstead's tidy social fabric, women whose disappearances wouldn't spark headlines or community-wide searches. They were invisible, both in life and in death. A fact that Nathan considered a twisted sort of blessing. At first, he worked alone. He scouted bus stops, truck stops, and the edges of highways just outside of Elmstead, looking for women who seemed lost or desperate. Posing as a kind stranger, he would offer them a place to stay, just for the night. "You remind me of my daughter," he'd say with his practiced, gentle tone. "I can't imagine leaving you out here all alone." Most of the women he approached had no better options, no family to check in on them, and no one to miss them. What began with subtle coercion eventually escalated into outright violence. By the time local authorities even noticed a pattern of missing persons, McCarthy had refined his methods into a well-oiled machine. He wasn't just preying on vulnerable women anymore, he was working with accomplices, an underground network of criminals who saw the value in what McCarthy was doing and wanted a cut. Together, they began actively abducting women and transporting them across state lines, where McCarthy would either prepare them for burial as spiritual brides or sell their remains to other brokers in the Midwest. For Nathan, this wasn't personal, he wasn't driven by bloodlust or hatred. To him it was business, dirty, brutal business, but business nonetheless. In his mind, he wasn't a criminal. In fact, if you'd asked him, he probably would have told you he was doing something noble, even necessary. After all, wasn't he bringing peace to families? Wasn't he giving closure to communities bound by tradition? When questioned later, he would say, "I wasn't hurting anyone who mattered." But McCarthy did hurt people, dozens, maybe even hundreds. He hurt the women who vanished without a trace, the families who desperately searched for them, and even the families who bought into his grotesque schemes. He left a trail of wreckage across Elmstead and far beyond, turning rural superstition into a thriving black market. One of McCarthy's most infamous transactions occurred in 2020, when he sold the body of a 22-year-old waitress under the guise of a willing spiritual bride. Rachel Owens had been new to Elmstead, arriving with nothing but a backpack and dreams of starting over. She was quiet, polite, and unassuming, exactly the type of woman McCarthy targeted. After weeks of earnestly befriending her at the local diner, offering her free meals, and pretending to be a father figure, McCarthy struck. Rachel's body was later found buried alongside a deceased cattle rancher who had died 3 years earlier of a heart attack. His family had paid McCarthy $15,000 for her services. When investigators finally caught wind of Nathan McCarthy's operation, they were appalled, but not surprised. The disappearance of transient women in rural areas had been an overlooked epidemic for decades, and it wasn't uncommon for perpetrators to operate undetected for years. As authorities began piecing together the full scale of McCarthy's crimes, they uncovered dozens of shallow graves tucked away in remote farmlands and woods across Oklahoma and neighboring states. And yet, even as the walls closed in, Nathan McCarthy remained eerily calm. During his arrest, he reportedly chuckled and said, "People will believe what they want to believe. I just gave them what they asked for." It wasn't just Nathan McCarthy who was exposed that day. His arrest revealed the dark underbelly of Elmstead, its hypocritical reliance on old traditions, its tendency to look the other way, and its quiet complicity in horrors that could have been stopped years earlier. McCarthy was the mastermind, yes, but he thrived in a culture that willingly turned its back on justice in the name of tradition. The mysterious disappearances. At first, no one thought much about it. A single waitress who didn't show up for her shift, a young mother who packed up and left town without a goodbye. In a community like Elmstead, with its sleepy streets and sun-faded shop fronts, people came and went all the time. After all, Elmstead wasn't the sort of place that held on to its young people. If you were in your 20s or 30s and still there, chances were you felt trapped, as if the horizon of wheat fields was slowly boxing you in. But then, the disappearances began to pile up. Over just 14 months, 6 women vanished. There were no final calls, no goodbye notes, no signs of struggle. They simply faded out of their daily lives, ghosts before their time. What tied them together wasn't immediately apparent, yet there were a few threads that connected their stories. Each of them was vulnerable in a way that seemed almost designed to make them easy to overlook. Take Sarah Hutchins. She had been working double shifts at Miller's Diner for most of the previous year, waiting tables during the day and cleaning up at night. She lived alone, scraping by in a studio apartment a mile out of town. When Sarah didn't show up to work one Friday morning, most of her co-workers assumed she'd found another job or taken off for better opportunities, like so many others before her. Her landlord, who wasn't particularly attentive, didn't even notice she was gone until her rent was overdue 2 weeks later. By the time the police were notified, any hope of following a trail had long since vanished. Then there was Molly Drummond. Known mostly as the girl who always fidgeted by her neighbors, Molly had a nervous laugh and a habit of avoiding eye contact. She worked part-time at the town library, quietly reshelving books with wrinkled, ink-covered hands from her side hobby as an amateur poet. She was the kind of person people didn't question when she slipped into the background, so when she disappeared one rainy spring evening after the library closed, no one immediately raised alarm. It was said that she talked about wanting to leave Elmstead. Maybe she finally worked up the courage to do it, people suggested. And perhaps most striking of all was Rebecca Kane. Rebecca was a single mom, juggling care for her 3-year-old and working nights as a cashier at the lone grocery store in town. Known for her feisty attitude and bright blonde curls, she often confided in her coworker about how hard it was to make ends meet. One fateful October evening, Rebecca tucked her son into bed, said she had to run out to the store for diapers, and never returned. Her sobbing child was found the following morning by the elderly woman who lived in the apartment next door, but there was no sign of Rebecca other than her car, still parked in the grocery store lot. The police chalked it up to her skipping town, maybe finding the stress of her life too overwhelming. Family and co-workers asked questions at first, but when no new answers came, the whispers about her simply faded. This was the kind of place Elmstead had become. When women like Sarah, Molly, Rebecca, and others disappeared, their absence was treated as less of a mystery, and more of a mundane truth. People leave. But under this narrative of people leaving quietly, was a simmering unease, one that no one wanted to name. If these women had really moved on, why hadn't they told anyone? Why hadn't they taken their belongings, cashed out their small savings, or even arranged a concrete plan? Where had they gone, and why did their phones always go straight to voicemail? The sheriff's office, meanwhile, seemed reluctant to question these disappearances too deeply. Sheriff Don Parker, nearing retirement age and still using a dusty Rolodex to keep track of his contacts, had a very particular way of looking at things. "People have their reasons," he said in a town meeting after Molly's disappearance had raised some eyebrows. "They leave. It's not always for us to know why." Yet as much as Parker wanted to dismiss it, the whispers kept growing. 6 women gone in a little over a year wasn't something you could sweep under the rug, no matter what shelf of old case files you tried to tuck it into. Then came the discovery of Erica Powell's car. Erica hadn't been formally reported missing. Like the other women, she lived a quiet and solitary life, working shifts at the local bar, and walking to her rented room above an auto repair shop. But when a local farmer stumbled across her abandoned car just outside Elmstead's borders, everything shifted. Inside the vehicle, investigators found traces of blood on the fabric of the passenger seat, and a crumpled piece of paper stuffed into the glove compartment. When the paper was unfolded, it revealed a handwritten list of names, several of them matching the women already reported missing. The discovery sent chills through Elmstead, once so sure of its safety. For years, residents had gone about their lives believing they were immune to the dangers that lurked in cities or on cable news crime dramas. But now there was evidence, real and undeniable, that something was terribly wrong. Paranoia seeped into conversations at diners and church gatherings. Women avoided walking alone, even during the day, and parents suddenly felt the need to reprimand their teenagers for staying out late. Some pointed fingers at the truckers who passed through on their way to other towns, while others swore they had heard strange noises late at night coming from the forested area around Route 17. A few even speculated more quietly and with visible discomfort about whether someone in their community might be responsible. After all, no one really knew what went on behind closed doors, even in a small town. Despite the rising tension, the police investigation moved at a crawl. Evidence was minimal, and the occasional sightings of an unfamiliar van or hushed speculation about weird new faces in town led to nothing substantial. Sheriff Parker, out of both habit and incompetence, resisted calling for outside help. "We're handling it," he'd mutter. But more than a few residents suspected Parker was as overwhelmed by the situation as they were, unsure of how to proceed after decades of resolving petty thefts and parking disputes. What no one could deny, though, was that Elmstead wasn't the same anymore. A chill had settled over the town, one that no hot cup of coffee at Miller's Diner, no cheery Sunday sermon at First Baptist Church could shake. And as the weeks passed without answers, one thing became increasingly clear: something or someone was preying on the vulnerable in Elmstead, and unless someone stopped it, they wouldn't be the last to disappear. The first discovery: an abandoned car. The discovery that would unravel the fabric of Elmstead's quiet existence began with an unexpected phone call in the early hours of a crisp March morning. The voice on the line belonged to George Crawley, a local farmer known for his no-nonsense demeanor and blunt way of speaking. George wasn't the kind of man to call the sheriff's office for just anything. He handled most problems on his own, whether it was a trespassing teenager or a coyote sniffing around his chicken coop. So when Sheriff Don Parker picked up the phone and heard George's gravelly tone, he immediately knew this wasn't about wandering livestock or a missed delivery. "There's a car," George began, his voice steady but with an edge of unease. "Out on Route 17 near the old Miller farm. Been there a while by the looks of it, thought you ought to know." At first Parker didn't think much of it. An abandoned car wasn't exactly front-page news. People broke down on these old country roads all the time, especially itinerant travelers passing through. But George continued, his words chilling enough to make Parker sit up in bed. "There's blood," George added, almost reluctantly. "Inside. And something else. A list. Names, Sheriff. It don't feel right." By the time Parker arrived at the scene, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the endless fields of dry grass. The car was an old sedan, its once shiny maroon paint now dulled by layers of dirt and dust. It sat crookedly on the shoulder of the road as though it had been hastily abandoned. From a distance it seemed unremarkable, just another piece of forgotten machinery left to rust in the middle of nowhere. But as Parker got closer, the uneasy feeling scratched at the back of his neck. The driver's side door was locked, and the windows were up, their edges smeared with grime thick enough to obscure the interior. Draped across the hood were faint streaks of what he could only assume was dried mud, or maybe something worse. The ground beneath the car's wheels was undisturbed, suggesting it hadn't been moved in weeks, perhaps months, yet the car's presence there, so stark and out of place on a desolate stretch of rural road, seemed almost deliberate. It was George who had first peeked through the passenger side window before Parker arrived. His discovery was what prompted the urgent call. When the sheriff shone his flashlight inside, the dim beam illuminated what George had described. A dark, crusted stain on the fabric of the passenger seat. Blood, dried now and soaked deep into the material. The sight sent a chill running down Parker's spine. This wasn't just someone abandoning their car because of engine trouble. Something bad had happened here. But it was the glove compartment that held the most unsettling clue. The handle was scratched as though someone had fumbled with it in a hurry, and inside was a piece of paper, folded so many times it was fragile at the creases. Parker pulled it out with gloved hands and carefully unfolded it, revealing what lay beneath. A handwritten list, scrawled in shaky pencil letters, stared back at him. Names. Most of them unfamiliar to Parker, but a few that weren't. Rebecca Kane, Erica Powell, Sarah Hutchins. Names he recognized because those were the names of some of the women who'd disappeared over the last year. But there were other names too, ones he didn't know. Names that made him wonder just how many more women might have vanished without anyone noticing. The immediate priority was to check the car for anything else, fingerprints, personal items, anything that could lead to answers. Parker radioed his deputies, who arrived within the hour with equipment borrowed from the state police. As they combed the vehicle for clues, they unearthed more troubling evidence. A pair of earrings tangled in the center console, a ripped piece of cloth tucked beneath the back seat, and fragments of what looked like broken fingernails embedded in the doorframe. The car wasn't just abandoned, it was a crime scene. Parker knew better than to jump to conclusions. Rural folks were a practical breed. Lots of people traveled with random belongings in their cars, and bloodstains could come from all kinds of accidents. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was the key to something far darker. The names on that list confirmed what many in Elmstead had whispered but been too afraid to say aloud. The disappearances weren't a coincidence. They weren't the result of wanderlust or women running from their lives. Something terrible had been happening right under their noses. As word of the find spread through town, the usual hum of Elmstead's quiet life shifted into something else entirely. At Miller's Diner, where locals gathered for breakfast and gossip, the air was thick with speculation. "You think it's someone from the city?" one woman asked her companion over burnt coffee. "Might be one of those drifters," the man replied, his voice low. "They come through here all the time. Never trust 'em." But behind the casual theories lay a growing fear. Route 17 wasn't just an empty stretch of highway. It bordered the Dead Acres, a long-abandoned plot of farmland locals had whispered about for decades. Some said the land was cursed, that the ghost of the rancher who once lived there still roamed the fields at night. Others dismissed it as nonsense, calling the rumors nothing more than campfire stories to scare kids. Yet the car's proximity to that cursed ground only deepened the community's unease. The discovery of the abandoned car marked a turning point for Elmstead. For Sheriff Parker, it became clear that this was no longer something he could dismiss or handle on his own. The rural charm of Elmstead, with its picket fences and Sunday services, was crumbling under the weight of a mystery too big to ignore. The names on the list, the bloodstains, and the ominous location of the car all pointed to a horrifying truth. Elmstead wasn't the safe haven everyone believed it to be. As forensic teams arrived from out of town and reporters started sniffing around the edges of Elmstead, the townsfolk watched from behind their curtains. They listened intently for whispers of answers but dreaded what those answers might reveal. For Parker, the car was a puzzle piece, one that fit perfectly into a larger, more sinister picture. The only question now was how many more pieces there were to uncover, and whether Elmstead was prepared to face the darkness they found when the whole puzzle was finally pieced together. The secret graveyard, horrifying evidence. When investigators followed the thread of clues back to Nathan McCarthy's property, they anticipated finding something. What they didn't anticipate was the macabre discovery that would unravel decades of secrets and gut the very spirit of Elmstead. Hidden within the sprawling overgrowth of an abandoned family farm tied to McCarthy was a graveyard unlike any other. Tucked far from prying eyes under a canopy of dying trees was a secret burial site that would soon prove to be the epicenter of a grisly operation. The land itself had an eerie stillness about it. The farm, once owned by McCarthy's great-uncle, had long since fallen into disrepair, officially unoccupied for years. Locals rarely ventured near it, partly because it was remote and uninviting, but also because of the creeping legends that had developed over time. Stories of strange lights in the field, a sense of being watched, rumors of the rancher who had died there long ago, still tending his soil at night. It all lingered in the back of people's minds as a quiet warning: stay away. It wasn't until seasoned forensic teams descended upon the property, armed with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, that the full scope of McCarthy's grim atrocities bubbled to the surface. The dogs immediately led their handlers to an overgrown patch of earth, where the remains of recently disturbed soil hinted at something buried underneath. "They're bodies," one investigator muttered grimly after the first dig began. "God help us, there's more." The first shovel broke the hard-packed dirt, unveiling pieces of old wooden planks that barely functioned as makeshift coffins. What lay underneath was even worse: skeletal remains, human, female, some clothed in tattered garments that decayed alongside them, but others stripped bare, their identities long erased by time. Yet it wasn't just the presence of bodies that horrified the authorities, it was their arrangement. Each grave seemed oddly meticulous, as though they weren't dug hastily but with intention. The women hadn't merely been buried. Each was paired with a set of objects that investigators would later interpret as part of the sinister spiritual marriages. Withered bouquets of fake flowers, rusted wedding bands, locks of hair tied in ribbons. Each burial site read like some grotesque parody of a marital union. One victim was reportedly found wearing a jewelry box's worth of mismatched rings on her fingers, as if she'd been posthumously fitted to be the wife of some unknown deceased party. These weren't just murders, they were rituals. By the time the digging was done, the total number of graves reached 8. 8 human lives stolen and buried in a twisted attempt to satisfy a belief rooted in outdated superstition. And yet, investigators suspected there were more, either on someone else's property, or perhaps in unmarked graves scattered in the wildest reaches of the surrounding woods. Elmstead became a crime scene in the truest sense of the word, its long-held peace shattered by the darkness uncovered here. One grave stood out among the rest, one investigators couldn't forget even long after they'd left the forest: the body of a young girl, barely 18, who had been placed in a tattered lace dress. Her skeletal arms were delicately folded across her torso. In her small hand, she clutched a faded photograph of a rancher who had died years earlier of natural causes. The man's family, upon being contacted, reluctantly admitted that they'd paid Nathan McCarthy over $10,000 to marry this girl to their son to prevent his restless spirit from cursing their livestock and home. "We didn't know she was—" The family never finished their sentence. These confessions turned the investigation into a frenzy. Officers sought out anyone McCarthy had worked with, any families who had dealt with him. What authorities discovered sickened them as much as the tangible evidence buried in the ground. Entire communities tied to McCarthy and his horrific operation all seemed to hinge on the same misguided justification. This was tradition. These families weren't oblivious to what they were paying for, they simply convinced themselves the ends justified the means. Forensic experts worked slowly and carefully, excavating every inch of the burial site in search of anything that could piece together the victims' stories. For the families of the missing women, closure came at an unbearable cost. Sarah Hutchins, Molly Drummond, and Rebecca Kane, just a few of the names found on the list stuffed inside Erica Powell's abandoned car, were among those whose remains were positively identified. Despite their final resting places being found, many questions lingered. How had McCarthy chosen his victims? Was he tracking these women for years, or were some simply cruel twists of opportunity? Back in town, the rumors burned hotter than ever. The graveyard was quickly named the Marriage Patch by Elmstead's more morbid residents, underscoring the dark irony of McCarthy's crimes. Many of the townsfolk, once content with their whispered suspicions, now found solace in scapegoating McCarthy alone. That man was sick, some said, born evil. Yet few accounted for the way tradition and superstition had nurtured his crimes, how the pressure to uphold old rituals had turned murder for hire into something disturbingly acceptable. Beyond the graves, the evidence mounted. Police uncovered receipts for burial plots paid in cash, dozens of falsified death certificates, and ledgers detailing transactions that linked McCarthy to multiple families in Oklahoma and neighboring states. The funeral director wasn't working alone, he was the linchpin. From accomplices who helped procure victims to grieving families pressed into paying obscene amounts of money, McCarthy had turned death into an industry, and Elmstead had, for the most part, silently participated. What made the discovery of the graveyard so grisly was its juxtaposition with Elmstead's image. A quaint Midwest town with its white-steepled church where people waved from their front porches and the diner served pie you'd swear was homemade. But behind that facade was a haunting truth. The traditions binding the community together had also paved the way for its deepest betrayal. Now, there was no looking away. As news trucks rolled into town and journalists began spilling out into Elmstead's quiet streets, residents shut their doors and turned off their phones. But within every empty shop window, every stiff glance exchanged in the grocery store, one question lingered like a shadow. How many more horrors might still be buried, not just in the grounds of Elmstead, but in its silence? Ruthless tactics. Human trafficking for spiritual marriages. Nathan McCarthy's operation wasn't just morally bankrupt. It was an organized, calculated web of human suffering. What began as a macabre extension of local superstition soon spiraled into the darkest corners of the human trade. To satisfy the grim demands of spiritual marriages, McCarthy became the architect of a trafficking network that stretched far beyond the quiet confines of Elmstead. His methods weren't just depraved, they were ruthlessly efficient. McCarthy realized early on that Elmstead alone couldn't sustain the supply he required. The townsfolk could only overlook so many missing women before inconvenient questions arose, and he understood that every disappearance would eventually paint a target on his back. So, he expanded. Partnering with criminal elements from neighboring towns, states, and even transient groups who eked out a living along highways, McCarthy created a system where the vulnerable were identified, lured, and brutalized for profit. The victims of this operation were not random, they were carefully chosen. McCarthy had a sharp eye for spotting the people no one else seemed to notice. A waitress in a rundown diner, a teenager sleeping on a bus stop bench, a struggling single mother estranged from her family. Their circumstances made them invisible, even in the best of times. All it took was a small measure of deceit, a handful of lies, and McCarthy could claim another life to feed his grisly trade. His star players in this operation were scouts, shadows on the margins of society who understood these invisible lives better than most because they lived on the fringes themselves. Truckers who frequented seedy motels, bar owners who served drinks to drifters, and even desperate homeless people paid in cash. These individuals formed the pipeline of McCarthy's supply chain. "See someone traveling alone? Someone look out of place, let me know," McCarthy would instruct his scouts. For every lead that turned into a captured victim, the scout would receive a tidy bonus, along with reassurance that McCarthy would keep law enforcement at bay. The first step was always the approach, casual and deceptively kind. McCarthy knew how to slip seamlessly into his role as the friendly stranger. Many of his victims were offered a ride, a meal, or shelter for the night. "You look lost," he'd say, his practiced, fatherly tone carefully calibrated to disarm suspicion. "I've got a warm bed at my place, just until you figure things out." For women already grappling with fear, hunger, or exhaustion, McCarthy's offer often felt like salvation. But salvation was a lie. Once his victims accepted his help, it didn't take long for the mask to drop. The kindness turned to aggression, and the hospitality became a prison. McCarthy wasn't interested in long, drawn-out games. Once he had his victims subdued, sometimes through drugs and other times through brute force, he would prepare them for their grim purpose. His remote property was well equipped for its macabre function, soundproofed rooms, chains hidden beneath layers of hay in his old barn, and an arsenal of tools designed more for control than utility. While some victims were kept alive just long enough to fulfill the twisted role of a symbolic bride, others weren't as fortunate. McCarthy's operation worked on timelines driven by demand. Families seeking spiritual marriages for their deceased loved ones often paid premiums for quick turnarounds. These families, blinded by desperation or superstition, didn't ask questions about where the bride came from. They only wanted assurances that the ritual would calm whatever restless spirit they believed was haunting their lives. One horrifying case revealed the extent of McCarthy's disregard for human life. A 19-year-old runaway named Jessica Perkins was found dead near a creek 14 miles outside of Elmstead, though her family had stopped looking for her months earlier. Jessica had left home after an argument, her belongings packed into a cheap suitcase. Witness reports later revealed she had been seen hitchhiking near the Oklahoma border, where one of McCarthy's trucker scouts likely picked her up. Jessica, trapped in McCarthy's network, became the bride in one of his sham spiritual marriages. After fulfilling her role, she was discarded like garbage. Her body was left where the water could wash away any lingering evidence, though a piece of fabric from her dress tied her back to one of McCarthy's clients, a wealthy rancher who had paid $12,000 for the ritual to protect his land from bad spirits. But even these transactional marriages weren't enough to sustain McCarthy's greed. When local demand waned or payment faltered, the funeral director expanded into new territory, selling victims outright. His reputation among the hidden circles of trafficking and exploitation grew steadily, drawing buyers from other states who sought no-questions-asked acquisitions. He connected with underground brokering rings that specialized in disrupting investigations and erasing trails. For McCarthy, it didn't matter whether his victims lived or died. They were products in a market he had mastered. Perhaps the most chilling part of McCarthy's network was its ability to thrive in plain sight. On the surface, Elmstead appeared untouched by the atrocities brewing beneath it. Smiling townsfolk waved to one another on Main Street. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from local diners. Sermons boomed over the calm hum of Sunday mornings. Meanwhile, people like Nathan McCarthy exploited the calm, using Elmstead's sleepy disposition as the perfect backdrop for horror. Every so often, though, cracks would form. Rumors spread about young women hitchhiking out of town and being paid cash to work at undisclosed jobs in nearby cities. Some who knew McCarthy personally even questioned his wealth. How did a funeral director in a town like Elmstead manage to afford renovations on his property while buying plots of land upstate? But the whispers were fleeting, dismissed as small-town gossip. People revered McCarthy for his surface-level professionalism, and no one wanted to dig too deeply into Elmstead's golden reputation. McCarthy's most devastating advantage, however, was his deep understanding of human behavior and fear. The victims who survived, though few, described how he used their own doubts and insecurities as weapons against them. "No one's coming for you," he would taunt. "If you were important to someone, they would have found you by now." These words broke his victims before physical harm even began. He capitalized on their isolation and ensured their silence by destroying their hope first. As investigators peeled back the layers of McCarthy's operations, the cruelty of his scheme became horrifically clear. Justice finally came when survivors, brave enough to recount their experiences, spoke openly about their abduction and abuse. Their testimonies painted McCarthy not just as a man driven by greed, but as someone who had perfected the exploitation of human fragility. In the end, Nathan McCarthy's trafficking network was more than just an engine of greed. It was an indictment of the fragile systems that allowed people to fall through the cracks. His methods were deliberate, brutal, and efficient, turning vulnerable lives into mere commodities. The victims, the forgotten women. The victims of Nathan McCarthy's horrifying scheme were not random. To the rest of Elmstead, these women were whispers, shadows fading into the background of everyday life. For McCarthy, they were opportunities, carefully chosen targets whose lives could be erased with little resistance. They were women on the fringes of society, unlucky souls battling circumstances that had already made them invisible long before they crossed paths with McCarthy. What tied them together wasn't just their solitude or vulnerability, it was the cruel neglect of a world that had turned its back on them. Many of these women had come from difficult lives. Some were runaways trying to escape abusive homes or dead-end circumstances. Jessica Perkins, for instance, was just 19 when she left her family after a heated argument with her stepfather. She packed a small bag, hitched a ride to the nearest bus station, and told herself she'd figure things out when she got to the city. But the city was far away, and somewhere along a lonely stretch of highway, she met one of McCarthy's trucker scouts. Jessica, like many others, thought help had arrived when a stranger offered her warmth and safety. Instead, it was the beginning of her nightmare. Others worked low-wage jobs in Elmstead and surrounding towns trying to get by. Women like Sarah Hutchins, who waitressed long hours at Miller's Diner where tips were meager, or Molly Drummond, the shy librarian whose ink-stained hands were the only visible sign of her quiet passion for poetry. Sarah was known for her wry humor, and how she always remembered her regulars' coffee orders. Molly, on the other hand, was the type who stayed unnoticed, a girl who reshelved books in silence and avoided eye contact. No one suspected when either of them disappeared. For Sarah, people assumed she'd left town for better opportunities like so many before her. For Molly, they figured she had finally fled the suffocating small town that never quite fit her. By the time anyone realized they were gone, there wasn't even a trail left to follow. Rebecca Kane's story was particularly heartbreaking. A single mom doing her best to raise her 3-year-old son, Rebecca worked the night shift at Elmstead's only grocery store. She was known for her bright blonde curls and an attitude that kept her coworkers laughing, even on bad days. Her life wasn't easy, but she handled it with grit, often confiding in others about how much she wanted her son to grow up away from the struggles she faced. One night, after tucking her son into bed, Rebecca stepped out to buy diapers at the very store where she worked. She never returned. Her car was found in the parking lot the next morning, the front seat untouched as if she hadn't even gotten inside. Her son's cries woke the elderly woman next door, who found him alone. No trace of Rebecca was ever found, until investigators unearthed her name on Nathan McCarthy's list. These women all had lives, stories that were left unfinished without anyone there to tell them. They were the waitresses who worked double shifts, the mothers who scraped and struggled, the girls who slipped through the cracks of society unnoticed. And because of this, they became ideal prey for McCarthy's operation. The system seemed rigged against them from the start. No safety nets, few loved ones long enough in their lives to report them missing, and a society too busy or indifferent to ask why they left without a trace. Some victims were drifters, young women passing through Elmstead who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. McCarthy would charm them with his practiced kindness, offering rides or meals when they appeared to have nowhere to go. For women like Emily Saunders, a waitress from out of state struggling to escape an abusive boyfriend, McCarthy's act as the concerned Good Samaritan felt genuine. Emily accepted his ride one evening after finishing her shift at a temporary diner job. She thought she was getting a head start on her future. She didn't know McCarthy had been observing her for days, waiting for the right moment to act. Days later, her belongings were found dumped in a ditch 10 miles away, but her body wouldn't be discovered until months after McCarthy's arrest. A horrifying pattern began to emerge as more names and details surfaced. Most of McCarthy's victims shared backgrounds that left them isolated or detached from the support systems that could have protected them. Women battling mental illness, addiction, or estranged relationships were especially at risk. There were women who had long histories of being overlooked, orphans, adolescent runaways, or those with criminal records tied to shoplifting or drug charges. McCarthy seemed to thrive on this invisibility. He knew how to spot the warning signs of desperation, the restless glance of someone searching for a place to belong, the hesitant smile of someone who trusted too easily, the resigned walk of someone who had already experienced too much disappointment. One victim in particular haunted many of the investigators long after the case. Her name was Danielle Lopez, just 18 years old, and barely more than a child. Danielle had dropped out of high school and left home after losing her mother to cancer and her father to alcoholism. She was last seen walking barefoot down a quiet back road just outside Elmstead, carrying 2 worn-out suitcases she'd probably found at a thrift store. This image of her, lost, wandering, hopeful enough to keep moving, stuck with the detective who helped identify her remains years later in McCarthy's secret graveyard. Danielle had been paired in a spiritual marriage to a long-dead farmer whose surviving family paid McCarthy thousands of dollars in cash. Her death became another heartbreaking marker in the trajectory of his atrocities. What made these cases even more harrowing was the apathy with which they were initially treated. In Elmstead, for people who had grown accustomed to women quietly leaving town for better opportunities, the early disappearances barely raised an eyebrow. Sheriff Parker frequently dismissed concerns with phrases like, "They're living their lives, not everyone wants to stay put." Even those closest to the victims often assumed they had left because of personal troubles. It wasn't until bodies were uncovered in McCarthy's secret graveyard that Elmstead finally confronted the uncomfortable truth. It wasn't just people leaving, women were being taken. Each of these women was more than the circumstances that defined their struggles. They were sisters, daughters, and mothers. They were teenagers who loved listening to country music on gravel backroads, or artists who sketched landscapes in cheap notebooks. They were people with dreams, however modest, dreams of normal lives, of survival, of something better. And while McCarthy preyed on them for his greed, it was society at large that made them vulnerable by failing to see their worth in the first place. What remained was gut-wrenching in its simplicity. They should have been noticed. They should have been missed sooner. They should have been saved. A clue from an elderly woman. It started with a trembling voice on the other end of the phone, a woman calling from 2 towns over, far enough that Elmstead's darker secrets hadn't fully reached her doorstep, but close enough that she had heard whispers about Nathan McCarthy. She introduced herself as Betty Gardner, 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher living alone since the death of her husband a decade earlier. At first her words were hesitant, guarded. It was the state investigators desperate for leads who convinced her to come forward. "I think," her voice cracked as she began, "I think he's the man who came to see me after my daughter passed." It took Betty several hours to recount her story in stark detail, and even then, she broke down midway through, apologizing for her courage fading in and out. But what she told them would blow the case wide open, a puzzle piece everyone had been reaching for, but hadn't thought to look in the shadows for. Several years earlier, Betty's daughter Clara had died tragically in a car accident. At 25, Clara was the light of Betty's life, her only child, her companion, her reason to keep going after her husband's death. Clara had been bright, headstrong, someone who Betty always said would have gotten away from the monotony of small-town living. But life had its own plans. One stormy night, Clara's car skidded off the road outside Betty's home, flipping into a ditch. She never came back from it. The loss broke Betty in ways she didn't think she could recover from, and just when the family was reeling, fresh in the shock of grief, Nathan McCarthy appeared at their door. Back then, Betty didn't know anything about McCarthy beyond the funeral home he operated. He wore an unassuming suit, his demeanor gentle, his words carefully chosen. "You have my sincerest condolences, ma'am," he had said, his voice dripping with misplaced empathy. "I know this must be impossible for you." At first, Betty thought his visit was just standard procedure, something funeral directors did in small towns, but that didn't explain how he lingered when most people would take their leave, or how his words soon grew more invasive. Quietly and delicately, McCarthy presented her with an idea. It felt harmless at first, even comforting in a way, a spiritual marriage to help her daughter's soul find peace. He spoke of traditions Betty had barely heard of, old rituals meant to calm the wandering dead. Clara's young age, her sudden death, her unmarried state. According to McCarthy, all these things marked her as a potentially restless spirit. "I thought he was just being kind," Betty explained to the investigators. "I thought maybe he felt sorry for us, and this was one of those silly rural customs people still talked about in whispers. I didn't want to offend him, you know." But McCarthy hadn't been kind. He had been opportunistic. Over the next several weeks, Betty reported that he made repeated visits, speaking with quiet urgency about how Clara's death could disrupt the harmony of the living. He appealed to Betty's fears, warning her about misfortunes that could befall her home or her late husband's gravesite. One incident stood out in sharp relief for Betty. A storm struck their tiny town, uprooting tree branches and stripping siding from rooftops. McCarthy arrived the next day, unprompted. "Things like this won't stop, you know," he said softly, his words hitting Betty like darts. "This is the spirit calling for resolution." At first she resisted. The idea of marrying off her dead daughter to another departed soul even symbolically felt absurd. But McCarthy didn't let up. He was patient, calculating. Over time, what little mental energy Betty could muster was chipped away by his persistence. He showed her an old photo of one Joseph Young, a young rancher who had died tragically years earlier, unmarried and childless. Joseph's family, wealthy, isolated, and steeped in superstitions, was eager to secure peace for their son's spirit, and McCarthy acted as their middleman. "It's not about money," he had told Betty at one point, though the sum they offered was astronomical. "It's about bringing resolution to both sides. Aren't we obligated to secure Clara's peace?" That feeling of obligation, the gnawing guilt that maybe rejecting the ritual would damn her daughter's soul, was what finally broke Betty. After weeks of manipulation she agreed, not realizing that the arrangement wasn't as symbolic as McCarthy had implied. Negotiations stretched on, with McCarthy presenting the terms like a salesman, decisions on where Clara's name would appear on the family Bible, payment details, even the design of the gravestones to mark this spiritual union. It wasn't until afterwards, years down the line when Betty came across rumors of Elmstead's missing women, that she realized the true depth of McCarthy's depravity. He hadn't asked Betty for Clara's name and photograph out of solemn respect. He had sold her daughter into his macabre operation. Though Clara had already passed, her remains had become a part of something far darker than Betty could have ever imagined. McCarthy hadn't just arranged the spiritual marriage. He had used Clara's name for falsified marriage documentation, collecting both payment and the symbolic prestige it gave to his shadowy dealings. "I didn't think I had another choice," Betty whispered, her voice cracking as investigators prodded for the details of the initial transactions. If I had known what he was capable of, what he really was, I would have locked my door that day." Betty's story became one of the most critical testimonies for prosecutors against McCarthy. Investigators found enough undisputable evidence tied to her daughter's case. Falsified records suggesting Clara had been married to Joseph Young, proof of financial transactions taken from Joseph's family to McCarthy, and even contact logs left in McCarthy's ledger that showed how he had viewed Betty as pliable. It was a chilling detail that highlighted McCarthy for who he truly was. Betty's account also shed light on how far McCarthy had gone to exploit his funeral director role. He wasn't just preying on the living, he preyed on grief itself, mining the vulnerabilities of mourning families until they became co-conspirators in his horrific crimes. Her testimony became national news, a haunting snapshot of how easily people's fears and traditions could be manipulated. But for Betty, it didn't bring peace. She had spent years haunted by Clara's death, never allowing herself to question the details of McCarthy's involvement until he was eventually exposed. For Betty, the guilt was a weight she carried everywhere she went. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she told the courts during McCarthy's trial. Her trembling hands clasped the microphone, her voice barely audible against the sound of cameras clicking. "I thought it would give me back her memory. He took that from me too. All I have left now is regret." This account not only painted Nathan McCarthy as a predator who manipulated both the living and the dead, but it also brought into stark clarity how his network of lies had taken advantage of superstition, tradition, and emotional fragility. For Betty, sharing her pain became a public act of redemption, a way to ensure that McCarthy's monstrous actions would never be forgotten. The raid and damning evidence. When the decision was made to raid Nathan McCarthy's property, the air in the Elmstead Sheriff's Office was thick with a mix of tension and determination. This wasn't a routine operation. This wasn't about petty thefts or teenage vandals. This was about dismantling something far worse than any of the deputies had ever faced in their careers. What they were about to uncover wouldn't just implicate McCarthy, it would stain Elmstead forever. The raid began at dawn on an unseasonably cold Monday morning. A convoy of law enforcement vehicles, marked and unmarked, snaked through the back roads of Elmstead, kicking up clouds of dirt that mingled with the pale streaks of sunlight breaking across the sky. At the head of the team was Sheriff Don Parker, who, despite being visibly anxious, understood the importance of this moment. For years, whispers of disappearances, superstition, and McCarthy's odd behavior had colored the town's conversations. Now, with the FBI and state investigators taking the lead, it was time to bring those whispers to the surface. McCarthy's home and funeral parlor sat on the outskirts of town, shrouded in isolation. The land surrounding the property was vast but unkempt, overrun with weeds and scattered debris that spoke of decades of neglect. The house itself was a hulking two-story structure, a relic of another era, its windows dark and its paint peeling away in strips. Behind it loomed the funeral parlor, a squat brick building that seemed out of place in its rural surroundings, its simple sign hanging crookedly above the main door. This was the heart of McCarthy's world. When the convoy finally screeched to a halt, the quiet of the countryside was shattered by the commands of officers. "Move! Go! Go!" Deputies and federal agents flooded the property with weapons drawn, their boots crunching against the gravel driveway. A loud bang echoed as a battering ram forced its way through the front door of the funeral home, and within seconds, McCarthy's carefully curated facade began to crumble. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay, a grotesque reminder of the building's purpose. The initial sweep began quickly but cautiously, officers calling out to clear room after room. At first glance, the interior appeared almost normal, modestly furnished, tidy if a little outdated, but behind the veneer of McCarthy's professionalism was something far darker. In the front office, investigators uncovered shelves stocked with ledgers, photographs, and receipts, seemingly innocuous items that would later prove to be a goldmine of evidence. The ledger was the first major discovery. Pages upon pages of meticulously detailed transactions, many of which were labeled with cryptic notations like S. Hutchins match confirmed or J. Lopez secured. Alongside these entries were dates, sums of money, and references to clients, many of whom were from neighboring towns and states. These weren't funeral arrangements, they were records of McCarthy's gruesome trade. But the most damning evidence was found deeper inside the building, in the basement that some deputies were hesitant to descend into. The staircase leading down was narrow and poorly lit, each creak of the wooden steps amplifying the dread that hung in the air. At the bottom, the basement opened up into an expansive but claustrophobic space, its walls lined with industrial freezers. The smell here moved beyond chemical sterility into something distinctly foul, like rot trying to claw its way out into the open. When investigators pried open the first freezer, they recoiled. Inside, lying wrapped in heavy plastic, was a body, not embalmed for respectful preservation but crudely packed as if it were merchandise. As each freezer was opened, the scope of McCarthy's atrocities grew clearer. Some contained partial remains, others entire corpses dressed or posed in ways that hinted at the macabre rituals tied to his spiritual marriages. Among the items surrounding the freezers were bags of women's clothing, fake wedding rings, and tattered notes scribbled with names and dates. The emotional atmosphere in the basement was charged. Hardened law enforcement officers, some with careers spanning decades, struggled to maintain their composure as the grim discoveries piled up. One investigator, after opening what appeared to be a storage trunk filled with torn photographs and strands of human hair, had to excuse himself, leaving the room pale-faced and silent. The house itself offered no sanctuary from the horrors of the basement. In a locked upstairs bedroom, police found further evidence of McCarthy's sadistic system. The room appeared to double as both an office and a workshop. A desk crammed with notebooks, an aging computer set to a cryptically named file directory, and tools that looked more fitting for a torture chamber than a funeral home. Chains, syringes, even crude restraints. Each object painted a chilling picture of the control McCarthy held over his victims in their final moments. In a hidden compartment in McCarthy's desk drawer, investigators found dozens of official documents. Fraudulent marriage certificates, falsified death records, and unsigned blank forms ready to be filled out at a moment's notice. These were the tools McCarthy used to legitimize his inhuman trade. Even more chilling were the photographs tucked away in an envelope showing women dressed as brides, their expressions vacant, their eyes hollow. These images weren't just horrifying, they were trophies, a horrifying testament to McCarthy's complete lack of empathy. As officers searched the property further, cadaver dogs led them to a secluded shed behind the funeral parlor. The shed, though small and unassuming, held yet another horrific surprise. Buried beneath piles of old tools and debris, investigators unearthed shallow graves disguised by loose planks of wood. Each grave was marked not with a headstone but with crude carvings in the dirt, symbols that matched what authorities later learned were folk superstitions tied to spiritual marriages. These weren't just graves. They were monuments to the twisted rituals that McCarthy facilitated. The raid lasted hours, and each discovery raised more questions than it answered. By the time the sun was setting, the property was swarming with crime scene technicians, photographers, and reporters who had picked up whispers of what had been found. Yellow tape cordoned off the area as evidence was carefully cataloged piece by piece into dozens of boxes. Nathan McCarthy himself was taken into custody without much resistance. He was found inside the house, seated in his living room with a cup of tea resting on the table before him, as though nothing was amiss. When officers slapped the cuffs on him, he reportedly smirked. "Told you they wouldn't understand," he muttered, his voice unsettlingly calm. "Just tradition, that's all it is." But no amount of McCarthy's arrogance could downplay the weight of what was now on record. Bodies frozen like inventory, forged documents implicating dozens of clients, the bizarre and disturbing remnants of weddings that should have never occurred. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was the chilling epicenter of a decades-long operation that preyed on fear, greed, and superstition. What the raid accomplished wasn't just the beginning of justice for dozens of victims, it was the shattering of Elmstead's fragile facade. For years, people in the town had looked the other way, dismissing disappearances as coincidence or bad luck. Now there was no looking away. Elmstead hadn't just been a quiet bystander in McCarthy's crimes, it had been his stage. As the convoy of police vehicles carried McCarthy away into custody, and reporters flooded the airwaves with breaking news, one thing became clear: this moment would redefine Elmstead forever. No longer could it be the sleepy town where everyone knew everyone. It was now marked as the place where evil had thrived in plain sight, where tradition was twisted into an excuse for horror, and where silence had proven deadly. The historic trial and justice delivered. The trial of Nathan McCarthy wasn't just another headline in a country accustomed to gripping courtroom dramas. It became a turning point for Elmstead and a study on how deeply human evil could corrupt even the most unassuming of places. News vans lined the streets of the small Oklahoma town long before opening arguments began. The tragic scope of McCarthy's crimes, the sheer horror of the evidence unearthed during the raid, and the lives destroyed by his actions, made the trial a national spectacle. For months, the court proceedings consumed not just Elmstead, but the entire country. In the cold, impartial light of justice, McCarthy's history, motives, and methods were dissected and laid bare for all to see. It wasn't an ordinary trial. Every testimony, every damning piece of evidence, and every word exchanged between the prosecution and the defense reverberated like a shockwave through the courtroom and beyond. This was more than Nathan McCarthy being held to account. It was a trial that exposed the wounds of a community and forced a reckoning with the dark forces that had festered beneath its surface. A packed courthouse. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in the county courthouse, which had never seen a case of this magnitude before. People traveled for miles, standing in long lines outside the building hoping for a seat in the gallery. Those who weren't lucky enough to get inside gathered around television sets in homes, diners, and bars, glued to the live coverage that was broadcast nationwide. Elmstead's quiet streets buzzed with reporters, amateur documentarians, and true crime enthusiasts, all hoping for a glimpse of the infamous man at the center of it all. McCarthy's entrance into the courtroom was marked by a chilling silence. Escorted by armed guards, he showed no sign of remorse. His demeanor was calm, unnervingly so, as though he were still playing the role of the modest funeral director. Dressed in a simple suit, McCarthy moved stiffly, his face blank but alert, his cold eyes scanning the crowd as though he was silently calculating who among them would dare judge him. The prosecution's case. The prosecution's opening statement hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Marion Blake, the lead prosecutor, was a seasoned attorney with a reputation for dismantling complex criminal operations. Blake didn't hold back. Standing tall at the center of the room, she began by naming the victims, every name spoken with the weight of a small prayer for justice. "These women," she said, her voice unwavering, "were mothers, daughters, sisters, people who deserved life and dignity. Nathan McCarthy took that from them, for greed, for superstition, for power." Blake meticulously constructed her case. Over the course of weeks, she walked the jury and the captivated audience through McCarthy's years of deceit, manipulation, and exploitation. She painted a picture of a man who had no respect for human life, and whose business ventures turned fear and superstition into a thriving black market. Jurors visibly recoiled as evidence was projected onto a large screen. Photographs of the bodies found in McCarthy's freezer, his carefully falsified documents, his ledgers crammed with transactions for victims sold into spiritual marriages. The testimonies from forensic experts were damning. They described in painstaking detail the horrors uncovered during the raid: freezers packed with human remains, locks of hair tied like grotesque keepsakes, and burial sites adorned with objects meant to mimic wedding rituals. Diagrams of McCarthy's graveyard, his secret accounts, and his office full of disturbing tools were laid bare for the jury to scrutinize. Perhaps the most powerful evidence, however, came from the survivors. Women who had escaped McCarthy's trafficking network testified with remarkable bravery about their experiences. They described his false kindness during their abduction and the sheer terror of realizing they were trapped. "He smiled," one survivor recounted through tears. "That was the scariest part. He acted like he was still doing me a favor even when I was begging him to let me go." Every word was a nail in the coffin of McCarthy's defense. The horror, the detailed accounts of suffering, and the systemic way McCarthy operated left no room for doubt in the minds of the jurors. The defense's desperate strategy. McCarthy's defense team knew they faced an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming, and public sentiment was stacked heavily against him. Still, they tried to paint a picture of McCarthy as a weak man under the influence of tradition, a pawn in a much larger system of superstition and cultural pressure. He is not a monster, his lead attorney argued. Nathan McCarthy is himself a victim of a community and a system that demanded these rituals. Yes, he made mistakes, but he was trapped in the same beliefs that have trapped this town for decades. The argument fell flat. The prosecution swiftly countered by showing just how deliberate and methodical McCarthy's operation was. He wasn't following cultural norms, he was exploiting them. Nathan McCarthy wasn't a pawn, he was the mastermind. Betty Gardner's testimony. The pivotal moment of the trial came when Betty Gardner, an elderly woman whose daughter Clara had been manipulated into McCarthy's spiritual marriage scheme, took the stand. Betty's voice trembled as she recounted how McCarthy had preyed on her grief and guilt, manipulating her into believing she was helping her daughter find peace. Her testimony was devastating, not just because of her grief, but because it revealed McCarthy's complete lack of humanity. The public saw Betty as a symbol, the parent who trusted McCarthy, only to be betrayed in the most grotesque way imaginable. "I thought I was honoring my daughter," Betty said, her hands clasping a tissue. I didn't know what I was giving him." The verdict. After months of testimony, analysis, and emotional recounts, the courtroom held its breath as the jury deliberated. The decision came back quicker than anyone expected. The foreperson, a middle-aged teacher from a nearby town, stood and delivered the verdict with calm finality. Guilty, on all counts. Nathan McCarthy was convicted of multiple charges, including first-degree murder, human trafficking, and abuse of corpses. The judge, visibly shaken by the details of the case, declared that there were no mitigating circumstances that could warrant mercy. McCarthy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under Oklahoma law. As the gavel fell, a ripple went through the courtroom. For the families of the victims, there was some relief. Justice had been served. But for many, it was bittersweet. No sentence could undo the horrors McCarthy had inflicted. No punishment could bring back their loved ones. A legacy of justice. The trial of Nathan McCarthy went down in history, not just as the moment a monstrous man was brought to justice, but as a deeper examination of how fear, superstition, and silence allowed such horrors to persist. The small courtroom in Elmstead became a place where the voices of the forgotten were finally heard. For Elmstead itself, the trial was a reckoning. The town, once proud of its traditions, was forced to confront how those very customs had been twisted into justifications for unspeakable crimes. McCarthy may have been the one in handcuffs, but the town realized it too, bore responsibility for the culture of silence that had allowed his crimes to thrive. Outside the courthouse, activists and legal reformers vowed to ensure something like this could never happen again. New laws were proposed to protect vulnerable women and combat human trafficking, making sure the lessons from Elmstead would echo far beyond Oklahoma. For the rest of the country, the trial was a reminder of a haunting truth. Evil doesn't always come with fangs or horns. Sometimes it wears an easy smile, hides in plain sight, and thrives on the hopes and fears of those it manipulates. A warning from the case. The story of Nathan McCarthy and the horrors uncovered in Elmstead didn't just die down after the last gavel dropped in the courtroom. It became a storm that stirred debates across America, forcing communities to confront uncomfortable truths about the darker corners of society. What happened in Elmstead was more than a crime. It was a warning about the capacity for evil to thrive in silence, about the tangled web of tradition and fear, and about the vulnerable lives that slip between the cracks of our collective attention. For people in small towns across the country, the case came as a brutal awakening. Elmstead was supposed to be safe, a town of white picket fences, potluck dinners, and Sunday sermons echoing from the church steeple. The kind of place where you'd leave your front door unlocked at night and wave to your neighbors over the sound of a lawnmower. But behind this idyllic facade was the chilling reminder that no place, no matter how picturesque, is immune to exploitation, greed, and the corrosive power of silence. The case forced many to reckon with a hard truth. Evil doesn't always come dressed as a monster. It doesn't always announce itself in ways that seem obvious. Sometimes, it looks just like Nathan McCarthy, a polite, soft-spoken funeral director who knew exactly how to blend in, how to gain trust with a gentle smile and carefully chosen words. Evil doesn't have to hide in shadows, sometimes it thrives under the full light of day, shielded by the veneer of normalcy. A community's blind spot. The trial shone a painful light on Elmstead's collective blind spots. For decades the town had been content to live in its bubble, brushing off questions about disappearances and turning tragedies into whispered anecdotes to share over coffee at Miller's Diner. Everyone knew someone who had moved on, but no one ever stopped to wonder why certain people who seemed to disappear without a word, had no one searching for them. They'd just leave, they told themselves. It was the narrative Elmstead leaned on, the story they used to lull themselves into complacency. After all, people left small towns all the time, taking off for bigger cities, for new lives, or for freedom from places where rumors traveled faster than the church bell could chime on Sunday morning. And for women like Sarah Hutchins, Molly Drummond, or Rebecca Kane, women on the margins of society, it was easy to assume they had simply slipped away quietly, without drama or incident. But the truth was far darker. Their absences were not mere acts of chance, and the ease with which the town dismissed those women as just gone reflected a more insidious problem. How society often overlooks the vulnerable, the lonely, the lost. It wasn't just that McCarthy cunningly selected his victims. It was that the world, and especially Elmstead, gave him the perfect conditions to pick them off without anyone noticing. This wasn't just a failure of the police or institutions, it was a cultural failure. A failure to care enough to notice the missing. A failure to protect those who didn't have strong support systems in place. A failure to believe that bad things could happen in a sweet, sleepy little town like Elmstead. Tradition's dangerous grip. One of the most controversial aspects of McCarthy's crimes was how he weaponized tradition to justify his heinous acts. The concept of spiritual marriages was archaic even in the rural Midwest, little more than an urban legend whispered among older generations. Yet McCarthy resurrected it, manipulated it, and twisted it into the foundation of his operation. He preyed on families steeped in superstition, convincing them that they needed to perform these bizarre rituals to keep the dead at peace. And they believed him. Not because they were stupid, but because fear is a powerful motivator. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what might happen if they ignored the old ways. For many the trial wasn't just a condemnation of McCarthy, it was a reckoning with how dangerous blind faith in tradition can be. In Elmstead these rituals had started as folklore, something to tell children around a fire on summer evenings. But the persistence of superstition, combined with the unwillingness to examine or challenge it, created fertile ground for manipulation. The idea that families willingly paid McCarthy to perform these so-called spiritual marriages, essentially funding his violent enterprise, shocked the nation. Were they accomplices? Were they victims? In truth, they were both, tangled in a web of guilt, fear, and manipulation spun by a man who understood their vulnerabilities all too well. This aspect of the case served as a broader warning to rural America and beyond. Tradition, though often comforting, can become toxic when left unexamined. McCarthy used it not just to justify his crimes, but to make others complicit, turning normal people into unwitting participants in the suffering of others. It was a cautionary tale of how superstition, unchecked and unquestioned, can pave the way for horrors beyond imagination. Justice for the forgotten. The victims of Nathan McCarthy's operation were women who had already been forgotten long before they were taken. They were waitresses, librarians, single mothers, homeless wanderers, and runaways. They were women without safety nets, people who had slipped through the cracks of a system that was ill-equipped to notice or help them. Their stories struck a nerve across America, sparking conversations about how society treats its most vulnerable. How often do we judge without knowing their stories? How often do we dismiss someone's struggles as not our problem until it's too late? And how often do we let someone as unassuming as Nathan McCarthy exploit their invisibility because we're too busy to care? For activists and lawmakers, the case became a rallying cry. New bills were introduced to protect women in precarious positions, those living paycheck to paycheck, those with histories of abuse or neglect, those without families to report them missing. Policies to combat human trafficking gained renewed attention, and efforts to dismantle the kind of underground networks McCarthy exploited gained traction nationwide. The cost of silence. In the quiet days following McCarthy's sentencing, Elmstead became a ghost of its former self. The town that once prided itself on its charm and simplicity now bore the weight of its complicity. The residents began to ask themselves uncomfortable questions. How many lives could have been saved if they had spoken up earlier? How many women had they overlooked, dismissed, or ignored? How had they allowed their fear of disrupting the status quo to silence them? The hardest question of all lingered in hushed conversations. How many Nathan McCarthys were out there, hiding in plain sight in other small towns just like Elmstead? What made Elmstead unique wasn't the crime, it was the reckoning. Other places might have buried the scandal or refused to confront the cultural systems that allowed it to happen. Elmstead, though reluctantly, became a symbol of what not to do. Its silence had proven deadly, and its people vowed, however late it might have been, to never let it happen again. Nation learns a lesson. The McCarthy case wasn't just Elmstead's burden, it echoed across the country. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Documentarians descended on the town, interviewing the families of the victims and the townsfolk who had turned a blind eye for years. Schools added the case to curriculum discussions about human trafficking and vulnerability. And beneath it all, America wrestled with the uncomfortable realization that the systems meant to protect its people, law enforcement, social services, even community, they all had gaping holes large enough to swallow entire lives. Nathan McCarthy thrived because of those holes. His story became a warning not just about individuals who exploit others, but about the broader societal gaps that empower them. If Elmstead, and by extension the nation, had to learn one lesson, it was this: silence enables evil. Turning away, dismissing fears, or assuming someone else will take care of the problem doesn't just leave the vulnerable unprotected, it actively puts them in harm's way, a call for action. The aftermath of the McCarthy trial left many asking what they could do differently. As reforms began to take shape, one thing became clear. Accountability wasn't just for the McCarthys of the world. It was for neighbors, families, lawmakers, and everyone in between. It was about paying attention to the people we often ignore and questioning the systems we blindly follow. Elmstead will forever carry its scars, and the memories of McCarthy's victims will never be forgotten. But if the case taught anything, it was that no matter how small the act, challenging silence and breaking cycles of neglect could mean the difference between life and death. The story of this sleepy Oklahoma town became a rallying cry, a dark, painful reminder that even in the safest-looking places, vigilance and compassion can be the only true safeguards against the monstrous things hiding in plain sight.